Hello, welcome to our webinar today. We are delighted to have Dr. Kadie Patterson, who is the Coordinator of Social Studies and World Languages in the Office of Content and Assessment Design. She's going to do a webinar for us on the new Social Studies standard of teaching world history in Tennessee. So I will change the presenter to her and we will listen to Dr. Kadie Patterson.
Welcome. Today we're going to talk about world history in Tennessee. We have two goals for today's webinar. The first is to have a better understanding of social studies literacy, and the second is to have a better understanding of teaching religious topics in Tennessee. We will begin by looking at social studies literacy and what it means for our classrooms. When we think about how to best engage students in social studies, we should think about literacy as a central component. Literacy skills such as reading, writing, listening, and speaking are skills that students should use on a daily basis within a social studies classroom. By using ancient Rome as an example, sixth grade teachers should have students engage in social studies by building students' content knowledge about ancient Rome in order to fully understand about the time period. They should teach the concepts found within the standards on ancient Rome in sixth grade, such as the idea of a republic, to help students understand and gain a base of knowledge. They should also utilize the social studies practices, which are specific skills that students should apply when learning social studies, like using and examining primary sources, synthesizing data from sources, developing historical and geographic awareness, all to help guide their learning. Now, when we do this, students have used their literacy skills to demonstrate what they have learned. And that might include, for this example, what they've learned about ancient Rome and the Roman Republic. When we think about social studies, there's a difference between the skill and content involved. When we talk about skills, we are talking about reading, analysis, evaluation, using research, writing, problem solving, collaborative listening and speaking skills. All of these skills have a literacy component behind them. On the other hand, we look at content for social studies. And when we think about content for social studies, we think about facts, information, chronological events, philosophical, religious worldviews, historical eras, theoretical frameworks, and of course, the very specific content vocabulary that you find in social studies. Something to keep in mind when it comes to Tennessee is that we do not have specific content vocabulary for any subject. In social studies, our standards guide our content vocabulary. For instance, if you have a standard that says, describe the government of the Roman Republic and its contribution to the development of democratic practices in the rule of law, a written constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, representative government, and civic duty, your academic vocabulary would be things like rule of law, checks and balances, or civic duty. Teachers should use the standards as a basis for their academic vocabulary in their classroom. That's not just for social studies, that's for all subjects. Social studies literacy in our classes have evolved over the years and look very different than they did 5 or 10 years ago. Students should be digging into a primary source to learn about a topic in social studies. They should no longer just be reading a textbook to learn about a topic. We all had that class when we were in high school or middle school where all you did was look at the textbook and answer the questions and do the vocabulary words. And at the end of the unit, you took the section test. Well, that's not the way social studies works anymore. Teaching has evolved, and so should we. By introducing documents in the time period, we're giving students the gift of context and understanding of the times and what was actually happening to the people and giving a real-world aspect to social studies. In literacy for social studies, students should also be reading, analyzing, and interpreting primary sources instead of just glossing over or through a primary source. I know I saw students when I taught 8th grade, 7th grade, 6th grade, and high school, I saw students who I would give a primary source document to and a highlighter. and all they did was highlight the entire passage. They didn't read it. They tried to, but they couldn't. Just having them gloss over that source is not doing them any good. But instead, really breaking that source into pieces and having them analyze it in small chunks, giving them a dictionary only if it's needed, and instead having them use context clues to understand what a text or a word means. But we want a student who is going to look and analyze and interpret that primary source instead of just stare at that page. And our goal is to help them do that. We also want students to use context clues to understand academic vocabulary, because we know that if we just give a student a dictionary, they're going to look up every word on the page. We know it's a disaster to give a student a primary source and a dictionary. We don't want that for our students. We want them to use their cognitive skills to understand for themselves what a word means. We should also have students evaluating how trustworthy something is and not just memorizing a historical fact. For instance, we don't give students a list of people that are important to the Renaissance. Instead, we want students to learn about everyday lives and think about what's happening at the Renaissance. We want them to think for themselves and gather their own opinions. Instead of us telling them who they should study about, maybe they should tell us who they want to study about. They're not just memorizing a fact then. They're learning it because they want to learn it. This is very relevant in today's world because everyone has their own opinions and their thoughts, and we want them to learn how to decide what is real and what is not. There's no better way to do this than through primary sources and evaluating the trustworthiness of those sources. Finally, classrooms should no longer be getting the sit and get method. Students should be at the center of their own learning through actually doing and engaging social studies. Students should be the center of the classroom. The most important person in the room is not a teacher, it's a student. They should be actively engaged in their own learning and not passive learners. Active learners will use reflection, discussion, and problem solving to promote analysis and evaluation in order to guide their own learning, in order to achieve lifelong learning and success. And that is what we want for our students, lifelong success for college, career, and civics ready. Within our current social studies standards, there are 194 primary sources that are labeled as either to read or to consider. These are the documents that teachers should be using in their classrooms weekly or even daily to help build the content knowledge as well as social studies literacy skills. So on the screen, you see 3 examples of those standards. You see one from 6.1, from 6th grade, 6.13, that includes the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then you see 7.30, Tale of Genji. And then in 8.17, you see the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, or even Poor Richard's Almanac. Across all grades, students are asked to read specific primary sources. There are some others that I've listed at the bottom here, 3.17, 4.18, 5.53, and US 67, that also ask students to read very specific primary sources. But notice that these sources are specifically mentioned. Epic of Gilgamesh, Tale of Genji, Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Although the standard is specifically saying which primary source to read, it's important to note that this just says that students should read the document or learn about it or understand its importance. It doesn't tell them how they should read it, how much they should read, or if they should be reading more than just that one document. They should be maybe pulling in other documents of the time period to help them understand that document better. But by having students explore primary sources at an early age, we can prepare them for not only the next year, but also whatever the future may hold. That's why we should ensure that our students begin at an early age reading and analyzing primary sources. Students are also asked to analyze primary sources across all grade levels from multiple perspectives. Here we have another 6th, 7th, and 8th grade examples asking students in 6th grade to cite evidence from informational texts to explain polytheistic religion. In 7th grade, to gather relevant information about the 100 Years' War, Henry V, and Joan of Arc. And in 8.13, we're asking students to think about the development of colonial self-government. All of these are asking students to write and to analyze multiple perspectives. So let's look at some specific social studies strategies for literacy. One of the first methods is the inquiry method. This strategy allows content mastery through conducting short investigative research to answer questions or solve problems. It also involves synthesizing multiple sources on the subject while demonstrating an understanding of the subject under investigation. It has 3 main parts: asking a key question, examining resources, and making a hypothesis. This method involves teachers taking a step back and allowing students to take a step forward so they are the center of their own learning. When we start with the inquiry method, we're going to break each of these down individually. But something to note ahead of time is this is not something you'd use every day. This is a method that you would use once a month, once every grading period. This is not a daily occurrence, but it is a way to teach students how to think and analyze for themselves. So let's look a little deeper at the inquiry method. First, we have to ask a key question. I'm not going to tell you what this inquiry method is about, but here are the pictures to describe them. We're going to pose a question to our students using these 3 pictures. We're going to say, what can you infer about how these people died? What evidence supports your inference? Students may give us a plethora of ideas and answers. They may say, oh, these people all died because they were murdered. Or they might say, it's because that guy from Italy has a brick in his mouth. The guy from Poland has a blade at his throat. They might say that. But you would then also ask them some supporting questions and say, well, what do they have in common? Or how do you hypothesize how these people died or lived? What do you wonder? What are your questions? We're really asking them to question what's happening in these pictures and why it's relevant to what they're talking about at the time. We're not giving any information away. We're allowing students to draw their own conclusions, whether it's right or wrong. Some tips to start an inquiry lesson are to start with an image, to draw reluctant learners even to your topic. Have them rewrite a text or a topic to create a short text to help readers answer a question or even prove a theory. The next step is to examine resources. You might have students reading charts, graphs, images. You might have them use short text sets or use an excerpt as a short text. Using any of these methods will allow students to read multiple sources because there's not just one source. If you just have one source that's really long, students may get distracted. But if you have multiple short sources, that will help them understand better and will keep their attention longer. After students have received their sources, for our purposes here, let's use those pictures we saw on the last slide. What if I were to tell you they were from the Middle Ages? Would that help your discussion at all? Well, after you've given your students your sources, you would have them annotate the text, drawing inferences about what they're studying, maybe even asking more questions, like what information do these sources confirm or deny from your previous readings or from the pictures? What information do these sources add to your knowledge? What questions drive your inquiry? What answers did you find? So there are a couple of different strategies you can use during this inquiry method. You can have students do a gallery walk. You could have students do a jigsaw, a center. You could have them work independently. Within the inquiry method, you can use other teaching strategies. The inquiry method is just a way to have students inquire and learn and discover for themselves. Because regardless of the way students are examining resources, it's best for teachers to take a step back and allow students to work on their own pace and allow self-discovery. Now, the final step is to make a hypothesis. This can be done as an individual or as a group, but we want students to think and connect about what they have learned and how to develop their own argument. We also want to ensure that students use evidence to support that argument. So at the end of the lesson, you'd want students to have determined that these people all died for X reason. The reason they may have come up with may be different than the real reason, but if they're backing up what they found with evidence from a text, it's powerful that they're figuring it out on their own. They're discovering it for themselves. Now, a spoiler, all three of these people died and were found in mass graves as a result of the bubonic plague. But many people at the time also thought that if you had the bubonic plague, you could have been a vampire. So these are three examples of, is it a vampire or is it bubonic plague? Really neat understanding for our 7th grade students to have to really think about what it could mean, how these people died and why they'd be so scared. What was happening at the time in the Middle Ages to make them want to do these things to corpses or to skeletons? That will get a student's attention. This activity would last 1, 2, maybe even 3 days, depending on the number of sources you used. When I did this activity in my class, I had 7 sources I used, and it took 3 days. We had stuff about the Middle Ages before, during, and after. This wasn't the only thing I did during that time, but because they were using 7 sources, I broke it up to give them some rest. But regardless, this should be done in moderation. Once again, not every day, not every week, once a month, once a grading period. The next lesson, the next sample is called Reading Like a Historian. A Reading Like a Historian is a model that typically uses 2 documents where students will determine what the most reliable and accurate document is. It's where students investigate historical questions by employing reading strategies. The Reading Like a Historian originated from Stanford University. If you go to the Stanford University website, or you even just Google Reading Like a Historian, you will notice that they have multiple lessons available online free for teachers to use. The Reading Like a Historian process has 4 parts. Sourcing, which is done before students have read a document and gives them background knowledge. Contextualizing, placing the document in proper place and time. Corroborating, where evidence is used to confirm or support a statement. And closing, and a close reading, where you have a sustained attention to a complex text and allow the parts of the text to make it complex. Let's start with sourcing. The first step is sourcing. It's done before we read the document, and it gives background knowledge to help students analyze the document. It addresses questions like who wrote it, what is the author's point of view, why was this written, when was it written, is this the most believable, is this source believable, why? For example, let's look at standard 6.18, which says cite evidence from informational texts to explain the polytheistic religion of ancient Egypt with respect to beliefs about death, the afterlife, mummification, and the role of different deities. There are lots of fantastic eyewitness accounts to mummification that have survived over the years. Using an excerpt from one of those eyewitness accounts to mummification and comparing it to a modern poem or work of fiction or even a dictionary entry, you can ask students if they think which one is more reliable and why. Sourcing allows students to work on their own and to make inferences and predictions and observations prior to reading the document. students would be able to do things like identify an author's position on a historical event, predict what the author is going to say before reading the document, and even evaluate if the source is believable. And this is before a student has actually read the document. This is before they get there. This allows students to take the ownership of the source and become excited for what they might read. Who wouldn't want to read an eyewitness account on mummification? The next step is contextualization. Contextualization, which is the placing of reading into its proper place and time, addresses things like what else was going on at this time period when this was written? What was it like to be alive at the time? What things were different back then? What were the same? Again, this does not ask students to read the text. No, they're not reading the text yet here. All they're doing is drawing conclusions and details about this topic and about what's happening around that time. I like to think of it as big context and little context. When you think about big context, you're using your historical knowledge to think about what is happening in the world, what it's like to be alive at the time, and generalizations. When you use a small context, you're going to the source, thinking about specific details like dates or people involved and where the event is taking place. So when you think about the big context, students know, hey, I've heard of King Tut. That's a big context. Hey, the Middle Ages, big context. Sorry, Middle Kingdom, big context. Small context would be specific Egyptian burial sites or specific parts of the mummification process that are in that actual primary source. But while doing this, students should be using their background knowledge to draw meaning from the text. They are inferencing historical context. They're even recognizing that a document is just one moment in time, and they're understanding that vocabulary must be understood in a larger context. But it's through contextualization that students are able to really help understand what's happening at the time period. The next step is corroborating, which is a process that calls for sustained attention to a complex text and analyze parts of the text that makes it complex. This is where students would make a claim about it's going to have students address things like what claim does the author make? What evidence does the author use to support those claims? How does the document make me feel? What words or phrases did the author use to convince me that he or she was right? And what information does the author leave out? Students are answering these questions about documents, both individually and together. This is a comparison of the documents and a great place to read the text aloud or to have an audio of the text ready. This allows students to hear how difficult words may actually sound, and it may give them a better understanding of the text. Additionally, texts from 6th and 7th grades are difficult, and it's important that the length of these documents is not excessive. Instead, we should only include the pieces that students need to know to understand about things like the polytheistic religion of ancient Egypt with respect to maybe the beliefs of the death or the afterlife or mummification or the roles of deities. How did those connect? Pull out that one piece. But while completing this steps, students should be able to identify the author's claim about an event, evaluate the evidence or reasoning the author uses to support the claims, or evaluate the author's word choice and understand that language is used deliberately. In other words, students are looking at which text is more reliable and the differences between the two. This is where they will begin to compare the two documents together and discuss the differences between them. The final step is a close reading. Close reading is a process that calls for sustained attention to a text. This is where a student would find evidence to support which document they think is more reliable than the other. It might help them address questions like, what do other pieces of evidence say? Am I finding different versions of the story? What pieces of evidence are the most reliable or believable? Students will actually begin annotating the text this time through highlighting, underlining, note-taking, and answering even text-based questions. At the end, students should be able to establish what is true by comparing the documents to each other and recognizing the disparities between the two accounts. They can do this by working in pairs, in groups, or even as individuals if they like. Since this is the last step in the process, it is typically the longest, and it's intense, but is eventually gratifying for students to have the final outcome comparing the two documents. At the end of this part, students should be able to give specific reasons as to the benefits and drawbacks of each text and answer with evidence which text is more reliable. Again, reading like a historian method. It's a fantastic method. It's an inquiry-based method. But this obviously takes more than one day as well. This is another method that we can use to use literacy in our classrooms, but it's not something that should be used daily or even weekly. This is a monthly, a quarterly, or a grade period assignment. Some other strategy includes things like using context clues, using inferences, making predictions, using graphic organizers, questioning the text, note-taking that's graphic, prioritize information, a read, talk, write, a before a while. We want them to activate their prior knowledge. We want them to think aloud or visualize, evaluate their understanding. We want to monitor and repair understanding. Annotate the text, stop, question, stop, summarize, and question. Maybe make a concept map or read, draw, talk, revise. All the strategies should be done through primary and secondary sources to allow students to properly explore, investigate, and analyze primary sources in preparation of the next topic. We want students to have access to the majority of the 194 primary sources that are in our standards. If every teacher uses even half of those primary sources every year, then there's no reason why students would not be ready for their post-secondary career. Takeaway 1. If you teach students the skill of analyzing a primary source, it doesn't matter the source, as they will understand the process of analyzing them. We are teaching skills so that they will learn how to do it themselves, not only for now, but for later in life. So the second part of literacy is writing. Let's focus in on writing for a bit. We start with the question, why do we write? Well, writing is a physical evidence of thinking and is an important component of social studies. Students must use their critical thinking and critical writing skills to help them learn and provide evidence that learning has taken place. Historical writing calls for students to be able to write using historical vocabulary in the correct time frame while citing evidence from text. And writing helps you learn history and clarifies your understanding of a subject. There are many benefits of writing in social studies. In the short run, students and teachers are better able to appraise how well they grasp information and where deeper elaboration of key concepts is needed. Students are also able to take small pieces of content and analyze it for better connections. In the long run, students who use writing as a technique to learn content have their skills of thinking developed. The organization, summary, and analysis of content become easier for students, which produces richer understanding. And students become more practiced at using writing to communicate their learning and thinking. What we're producing here through asking students to write is lifelong learners, whether that be in a college institution or career setting. Students will need to know how to express themselves in writing for almost every aspect of adult life. And since social studies hits on society as a whole and culture, writing in social studies allows students to adequately describe the importance of life in general and to be successful in college career and citizenship. So writing in social studies, teachers should do many things. We should have students write frequently. We should teach students to write historical arguments where they make claims and support those claims with evidence. We should segment and model writing. Yes, I know we are not writing teachers, But social studies teachers need to understand that there is a place for writing in our classrooms. And we need to teach our students how to write historically. Teachers should also have students reading multiple texts, because we want to have students make evidence-based historical arguments. We want to have students write analyses of single sources and also look across sources to practice writing. We want to select text carefully so students encounter models of argument and see how sources are the raw materials for making historical arguments. We can also have them use tools like a tide or a Powtree, a rubric, or even a SOAP, which is source, occasion, audience, and purpose. The TDOE does not specifically subscribe to any of these, but these are all great ways to help students segment, model, and make writing explicit. Students should be writing as often as possible, but not every piece of writing has to be an essay. For social studies, longer written assignments should be given multiple times a year and focus on the content that students know and their background knowledge. But there's nothing wrong with having students write short snippets to prove their understanding of a daily topic. When writing in social studies, students should do a few things as well. They should assume the audience knows nothing about the historical topic. They should know that historical writing is based on fact. They need to activate their background knowledge. They should not base their whole essay off of a History Channel show they saw about ancient aliens. That's not going to give them what they need to be successful at this writing task. They need to activate their real background knowledge. They need to understand that history is linear, it's chronological, it's sequenced, and that's how they need to organize their historical writing. Historical facts should also support the time frame and, again, activate their background knowledge. But historical writing should be interesting. They need to provide details. They need to organize it clearly so it makes an impact on the audience. And if they ever use first person, they should write it as a historical figure. Although there are many similarities in writing in ELA and social studies, when students write in social studies, it should be clear that they are writing historically, using their background knowledge. Just like ELA, we want students to provide evidence, but we want that evidence to be backed up by their background or their prior knowledge. So what are some different ways to assess students through writing? Well, you can have students write a letter, describe the day of the life of a historical figure, compare, contrast, summarize, analyze, explain. You can have them support and present an opposing view. You can have them describe a primary source to support or oppose a person. Some other examples might be using exit slips, menus, foldables, interactive notebooks, social media mock-ups, a gist, or maybe even a quick write. Students don't always have to write an essay. Many of these types of writing are short and show that students have learned the content and concept they are studying. We want students to write as often as possible in order to explain what they know and how they know it, as well as show and provide evidence of their learning. Remember, the goal is lifelong learning. One of the biggest questions I'm asked is where you can find primary sources. Here are a few that I have found to be successful, or that teachers from across the state have also shared with me. Some of these also include free lesson plans. So the National Archives is great for both world history and U.S. history. So is the Library of Congress. Stanford's Reading Like a Historian has world history and U.S. history lesson plans free for teachers. The Gilder Lehrman Institute also has lesson plans free for teachers and primary sources. Fordham University also has primary source library. World History Matters has a primary source library. MTSU Teaching with Primary Resources. Not only do they have primary resources available, they also have lesson plans that are written specifically to our Tennessee standards. The Tennessee State Library and Archives, Teach TN History, and Eyewitness to History all also have primary sources available for free. So our final takeaway for this section is that through writing in the social studies classroom, students are better prepared to communicate information, clarify their thinking, learn new concepts and information, engage in types of writing practice that will enhance students' future academic and work opportunities. The second part of our webinar today is about teaching religious topics in world history. You might ask why we learn about history. The aim of teaching about religion is to better understand the religion's impact on history and culture, not to promote any one religion. In the spring of 2016, the Tennessee General Assembly passed a law. This is part of Tennessee Code Annotated 49-6-1005. The inclusion of religion in textbooks, instructional materials, curriculum, or academic standards shall be for educational purpose only and shall not be used to proselytize or establish any religion or religious belief. In Tennessee, that means that you should teach the standards without adding embellishments. You should teach about religion from a historical point of view, like the origins, the tradition, the relevance to the time period. You should teach religion within a larger unit and not individually. By following Tennessee Annotated Code 49-6-105, this also allows students to develop a more nuanced understanding of religion beyond a stereotype or simplistic representation. The reason for that is by not adding embellishments and by focusing on religion from a historical point of view within a larger unit, you are safeguarding yourself while also allowing students to learn that religion is part of the culture and history of our world. Within the current Tennessee academic standards, there are many standards that specifically mention a religion. You'll notice that Buddhism is mentioned in 6th and 7th grade, Shinto in 7th, Hinduism in 6th, Confucianism 6th and 7th, Islam 7th, Christianity 6th and 7th, Judaism 6th and 7th, and then other, which are religions like the polytheistic religions in Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt. There are additional 112 standards, 41 in 6th and 71 in 7th, that require a background knowledge of a religion in order to be taught. Religion is strand throughout 6th and 7th grade in its entirety, and that's why it's important that we teach it historically. Our current standards were adopted in July of 2013, and they will continue to be in use in our classrooms until the 2019-2020 school year. Our current standards are broken into 3 parts: standard number, content standard, and content strands. The standard number indicates the grade level or course for high school, and then the number of the standard. For instance, 6 is the grade level, and 68 is the standard number. The content standard provides the content of what students need to know. This standard, 6.18, is focusing on the origins and central features of Christianity and gives specific things that students should understand when it comes to Christianity through the bulleted list. The content strands include culture, geography, history, politics, and Tennessee history. However, for this standard, students are only asked to understand this standard through the culture, geography, history, and politics of the time. Note that there are very few standards in 6th or 7th grade, if any, that deal with Tennessee history, since 6th and 7th grade focus in on world history. So let's focus in on the content strands for a second and religion. Teaching about religion doesn't have to be stressful. By teaching about religion through Tennessee's content strands, we allow for religions to be placed within context of what is happening in the world at the time. Through the history, economics, culture, and politics of that time, and not the religion standing on its own. The content strands also help us analyze the impact of religion on the structure and cultures of society by using a historical perspective and not in a way that is biased. Teaching about religion through the content strands allows us to teach students to understand how religious beliefs, practices, and communications are created and maintained and transformed over time, which is very important in the 6th and 7th grades, as all of the major world religions begin and are transformed in their time periods. Additionally, the content strands allow us to look at the human experience in relation to the content strands, as well as art, literature, geography, and language, and how religion in turn has shaped them. Finally, teaching about religion through the content strands allows us to promote a cross-cultural understanding that is essential to democracy and world peace in today's world. There are 6 common suggestions when teaching about religion. They allow us to guard against interjecting our personal beliefs and teach through the attribution of how the religion has helped or hurt society and culture. The suggestions are to be academic and not devotional, to allow for awareness of religions but not press for student acceptance of a religion, to focus on the study about religion, not the practice of a religion, to expose students to a diversity of religious views, but not impose a particular view, to educate about all religions, don't promote or denigrate a religion. And finally, we want to inform students about various religious beliefs, but not seek to confirm students to a particular belief. All of these help teachers to guard against the interjecting of personal religious beliefs by teaching through attribution. So our takeaway number 3 here is the goal of academic study is to understand, not agree with religious views as they are being studied. Teachers must be teaching about religion and not promoting or celebrating one religion over another. A fair and balanced study of religion is needed that includes critical thinking and historical events that evolve religious traditions. So why do we study religion? We study religion because it is essential to the understanding of the nation and world. We study religion because it allows for an effective and engaged population in an interconnected and a diverse nation. We study religion because it helps to dispel stereotypes. It promotes cross-cultural understanding and encourages respect for others. We study religion because it provides an understanding of the various civilizations and cultures that have shaped history and society. We study religion because it empowers students to be religiously literate. And we study religion because it aids to the successful entry of the world of work or post-secondary education. In other words, we study religion because it provides an understanding of the various civilizations and cultures that have shaped history and society. When we learn about religious culture, we're helping students to understand that there are many types of religion. For instance, there are many types of Buddhists. There are many types of Christians. Every religion has divisions that need to be studied to understand the impact those divisions may have had on history, economics, politics, or geography within a civilization. We learn about religion through culture because it ensures that the context is given so students don't think that rituals have a single meaning, but that instead they persist across place and time. Most religious rituals started out as a small piece of history and have grown into something larger as civilizations developed. It's important that students understand the reasons for this and that religion has evolved and they're not static. Learning about religious culture allows for the understanding that religions are dynamic and ever changing. They evolve over time. For instance, without Martin Luther sparking a revolution with his 95 Theses, the Catholic Church would not have evolved, nor would the Protestant Reformation have happened. Learning about religion also expresses the ideas, practices, values, and stereotypes that are embedded in culture and not isolated. And finally, Learning about religions through culture shows students that religions are influenced by cultures, but they are also influencing culture. The cultural content strand here is so important when teaching about religion, because religion is shaped by culture and culture is shaped by religion. When it comes to teaching about religion and religious culture, we also have to think about religious literacy. Religious literacy is the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religions with social, political, economic, geographic, and cultural expressions across place and time. This includes the basic understanding of history, central beliefs, texts, practices, and contemporary manifestations of world religions. It is also important for our students to be religiously literate so they will be prepared for their post-secondary life. Being religiously literate allows our students to understand that religion is a complex and sophisticated social and cultural phenomenon. Being religiously literate allows students to recognize, organize, understand, and critically analyze how religion has been used to inspire and sometimes justify the full range of human history. Being religiously literate prepares students to engage people of different religions and beliefs with civility and respect. Finally, being religiously literate equips educators with the tools to teach intellectually responsible, constitutionally sound, and educationally meaningful ways. This allows our students to not only understand their religion better, but also understand why religion is important throughout the world. The goal is for students to develop a historical, culture, economic, geographic, or political understanding of how religion impacted people or places. Notice again, the content strands that are found within the Tennessee standards play a huge role in teaching about a religion. The goal for students also to have accurate representations of traditions in order to reduce the misunderstandings that arise from false generalizations. Another goal is to establish a culture of respect, because religions are internally diverse, dynamic, and embedded within culture. We want our students to be equipped with the tools to respect themselves and those around them culturally in our ever-changing world. Takeaway 4 is that learning about religion begins with a clear understanding of the crucial differences between the teaching of a religion and teaching about a religion. Let's discuss a few methods to teach about religion. Let's go back to the inquiry method. We're going to use this strategy to allow for content mastery, to involve short investigative research, to answer questions or solve problems. Remember from earlier in our session, we discussed the 3 parts were ask a key question, examine resources, and make a hypothesis. When using the inquiry method, when teaching about a religion, you should remember a few things. First, we're not evaluating what is right or true. Instead, primary sources and secondary sources are used to analyze how religious values, interpretations, or expressions shaped and are shaped by communities. Next, the inquiry method allows teachers to guide students how and why some religious individuals and communities gained social and political prominence and influence, while others became marginalized through a historical lens. For instance, why is Martin Luther a person of focus during the Protestant Reformation? What about other reformers? Why is he the person that we remember and that we teach about? And finally, the inquiry method allows teachers to help students understand that religions are eternally diverse, constantly changing, and are embedded in specific cultural and historical context. For instance, if we look at John Calvin on the Protestant Reformation, even as the Catholic Church was changing during the Reformation, his ideas about predestination further the Protestant ideas and divide. It changed the idea of Protestantism both historically and culturally. The outcome of the inquiry method is that by using the inquiry method in culture and historical lens, Students will learn that religions are not static and have impacted the history and culture of the world. Another way to teach about religion is to teach it in the context of what you are teaching and not in isolation. Contextualization includes placing a religion in its proper place and time, and includes how religions affect and are affected by cultural context and how they are diverse and dynamic. Let's use the standards 7.28 and 7.29 as an example. Looking at China, Korea, and Japan, and the influence of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Chinese writing systems. This standard can be unpacked, and religion can be placed in context in a few ways. The standards can be taught by describing how both China and Korea influence the culture of Japan through the spread of religion. Key points here would be how to discuss China and Korea were able to influence Japan culturally. Teachers should not just talk about religion here. There may also talk about the work of Prince Shotoku and his admiration of China and how he sent scholars to learn everything that he could about it. This standard could also be taught about by describing the dissemination of Buddhism and Confucianism to Japan and the impact it had on Japanese civilization. For instance, Japan's indigenous religion was Shinto. Its name, Shinto, came about in order to distinguish its indigenous beliefs from Buddhism. Teachers could ask questions of students like, what caused Buddhism to arrive in Japan? What role did Buddhism play in the spiritual, cultural, and social life of Japan? Notice I'm focusing not on just Buddhism here. Students need to understand the impact that the new religion had on Japanese civilization, and that could be Buddhism, Confucianism, or both. Now, finally, standard could also be taught by describing how the specific traits of Buddhism and Confucianism were brought to Japan and the impact that had culturally, geographically, and historically. This is a great place to bring in a major cultural impact, the arts. This includes the influence that Korean and Chinese paintings, architecture, and sculpture all had an influence on Japan. Notice that by teaching the religion within context and by chunking these standards together, we are embedding religion into the content strands. Another way to teach about religion is by chunking the standards. Many teachers already use chunking in teaching about social studies to cover all the material we have in our state standards. But chunking is another place that we can teach about religion in context, what is historically, politically, culturally, economically, or geographically plausible and possible for the time. What chunking does is it provides teachers with a framework for integrating content. It encourages students to pose and investigate questions relevant to both national and world issues. And chunking makes instruction meaningful by showing that the content strands work in cohesion with each other at any given time. The result is by combining standards that have commonalities, students can better understand history in the context of time. For example, by integrating religion into the history of a civilization or region, students understand that religion plays a large role in the context of that history. And as we have said before, religion is shaped by culture, and culture is shaped by religion. If we're talking about the polytheistic religions used in Egypt, we know that everyday life in ancient Egypt was impacted and affected by their polytheistic religion. By teaching about their polytheistic religion in context with everyday life and what was happening around them at the time, you are placing the religion into context and make meaningful instruction and learning for students. Another way to think about chunking the standards is to think topical. An example of chunking the standards, in 6th grade, there are specific standards that focus on religion that are separate from other standards that those civilizations are paired with. Standards 6.39 through 6.45 all cover ancient Israel, but 6.41 is a specific religion, Judaism. Instead of teaching 6.41 independently, Judaism's main traits can be taught with other standards to give context to the history of the religion and the region. For instance, it would be difficult to teach 6.42 and King Saul, David, and Solomon, or even 6.43 with King Solomon and the breakup and the destruction of the kingdom and Babylonian captivity without discussing 6.41 first. The topics for these three standards are all interwoven into the history of the religion, especially with the importance of key figures to both the religion and to the region. The religion is important here, but what is more important is for students to understand how the religion impacted the civilization of ancient Israel and how the civilization impacted the religion. So not just the civilization impacting religion, but religion impacting civilization. So when we teach about religion, what should it look like and what shouldn't it look like? Teaching about religion should present a religion's in historical context with the political and culture influence represented as central understanding. It should not be presenting about a region's religions without providing context of the region itself. Notice there is a regionality here. We want to place this in context with the region and what is happening at the time. Teaching about religion should emphasize the internal diversity of religions and the relationship of religion to culture, economics, and society, the content strands. What it shouldn't look like is focusing on certain categories that apply to many traditions, like beliefs, texts, rituals, origins, holidays, or how one should live. These are generalizations, and although they are true about some religions, they're not true for all religions, which is why we should not focus on them individually. Finally, teaching about a religion should recognize the ways that religion is embedded in culture and cannot be understood in isolation with particular social and historical expression. Because what we don't want to do is have a chart representing all of the religions, because it doesn't show the context and the socialization and the culture involved in how and why these civilizations came to be. Remember, each religion is unique, and each religion develops its own culture through history, and therefore it should be taught in context, keeping with the history of that religion. This allows students to have context again. Remember, learning about religion is not a vacuum. Religion is a complex web of practices and values. So what are the implications for students? We can't expect kids to grasp all the nuances of the major world religions and the controversies surrounding them. But if we're preparing students to be thoughtful citizens of the world, they should know something about people in their community who may be different from themselves. Our final takeaway is that students should have the chance to study a religion and should be exposed to diverse religious views, but not have one imposed upon them. We need to encourage students to learn about religions, but not to accept a particular religion. This is all in the hopes of being college, career, and citizenship ready. Thank you.
And thank you for being with our webinar about Tennessee world history. Tremendous amount of information. If you have any questions regarding this webinar, please email me, Bethany Bowman, and my email is learning@leaderutn.com. That's learning@leaderutn.com. If you have questions or more resources for social studies, go to our website, www.proedtn.org, and go to Educator Resources, look for classroom resources, and you will find social studies. Many hundreds and hundreds of links on all of these pages. Thank you for being a part of our webinar.